Well, good morning. Context is really important when you're reading the Bible, and Numbers 15 is no exception. What is this chapter about laws doing in the middle of a story about God's people entering the land? Why suddenly stop and do all this stuff which looks a bit more like Leviticus? Well, the context is God's people rebelling against him, faith giving way to fear, and indeed, the end of chapter 14 yesterday, ignoring what God had said to them about now they weren't able to go into the land, and they try and go in anyway, and they get defeated straight away by the Amalekites and the Canaanites. In that context, chapter 15, verse 2 is pretty extraordinary. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land you are to inhabit, which I am giving you. So hang on a minute. Even though God's people have been proven once again to be sinners, to have messed up, there's going to be a delay, but nevertheless, God is going to bring his people into the land. And so he's still now instructing them, not about things which affect their life right now where they are, but about what life is going to be like in the land when he gets them there. So this is about grace for sinners who don't deserve it. And what you get in the first half of chapter 15 up to verse 21 is law about fellowship offerings, first of all, which are about just maintaining relationship with God. And then you get some things about unintentional and intentional sin. Now that might raise questions for us, because we might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, is sin really unintentional? Well, when I think something's been done unintentionally, I tend not to think of it as a sin. I sort of think, well, I can excuse it. I didn't mean, you've interpreted the way that I've spoken to you as being sort of rude to you, but I wasn't being rude. I wasn't intending to, and we defend ourselves. And actually, often that's not a very helpful approach to our sin and the way that we hurt other people. And we tend to say, actually, look, all sin really has an intentional aspect to it. And if you sort of lash out at somebody, that's not an anomaly. That's revealing what's really going on in your heart. And most of the time, we kind of keep a rein on what's going on in our heart. But sometimes we sort of lash out in malice or anger or whatever. And that's because our hearts are broken and there's a real heart problem that needs to be dealt with. So does this unintentional, intentional distinction really help us? The other thing to think about in that context is actually the Bible is full of examples of what look like intentional sins being forgiven. So, I mean, the famous example would be David and Bathsheba. It doesn't get much more intentional than David's adultery, first of all, with Bathsheba, and then his conspiring for the murder of Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. That's pretty intentional, and yet it is forgiven. So what is going on here? It seems to be more that the distinction is not between unintentional and intentional in the way that we might use those words, but between what you might call normal sin and high-handed, which is one of the words that some of the Bible translations use, high-handed, defiant, deliberate, I am doing this against God and I know that I am and I mean it, kind of sin, which the New Testament would translate into what it calls the unforgivable sin, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. The example that we get here in Numbers 15 is this Sabbath breaker guy, which again might sort of surprise us and think this is a bit over the top, isn't it? This poor guy is just gathering sticks. But no, hang on, just think about it. Clearly this is meant to be an example of high-handed intentional sin, so he must be doing it in a kind of intentional way of, stuff these rules, I'm going to go my own way. And what do you gather sticks for? Well, sticks in that context would be used for firewood. You're going to light a fire, also forbidden on the Sabbath day. A fire is a pretty obvious thing that the whole community would see, because you can see what's going on around you in the desert. So here is this man who is doing an example of high-handed, defiant sin, and he is cut off from the people. He is stoned as a result. Now, as I say, the New Testament equivalent of that seems to be this idea of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, or what Jesus sometimes refers to as the unforgivable sin, the sin that cannot be forgiven. And we kind of think, oh dear, maybe have I committed that kind of sin? And the answer, of course, that is pastorally wise, is to say that the people who are asking that question are unlikely to have committed the unforgivable sin, because the unforgivable kind of sin of high-handed defiance, fist-shaking at God, doesn't care about the fact that it's committing that sin. It's sort of saying, stuff you, God, I don't care what you think, I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm going to carry on in that way. And if we reject the forgiveness that is offered to us in Jesus, that seems to be the unforgivable sin in the New Testament for Christian people. Refusing the forgiveness that is on offer in Jesus, saying, no, I'll pay for my sins myself. That seems to be the equivalent of this in the New Testament people of God. But this is a chapter about grace for sinners. The Old Testament, just as in the New Testament, is full of grace, full of ways for God's people to be made right with God so that he can dwell with them. He can bring them into the land as he's promised. And God's people can live with him as their God, and they can be his people. And so in the light of all that's going on at the moment, and we're probably more conscious of sin than ever, more conscious of failure, more conscious of the ways that our circumstances seem to bring out new kinds of sin that we didn't even know were there. Let's keep trusting in the God who in the face of his people's sin makes extraordinary promises and still carries on his plan to bring his people into the land, to bring his people to the new heavens and the new earth, despite all that we do, because Jesus has died for us and has risen, and that future is certain. So let's keep trusting him.